The morning began with a hush so deep it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Heat already shimmered along the horizon. Though the sun had barely crested the rim of the desert, a brittle wind swept across Rattlesnake Hollow, carrying the smell of dry sage and wood smoke, teasing the torn curtain that hung in McKenna Homestead's lone kitchen window. Inside, where the light pulled in long honeycombed streaks across worn floorboards, Lark McKenna bent over the table, coaxing dough with one good hand. The other lay bound in rough linen, fingers swollen and purpled, each movement sending a quiet ache up her arm. She moved carefully like a dancer who'd learned to step around pain. The dough resisted her, clinging heavy, but she pressed and folded with a steadiness born of necessity. Her breath misted faintly in the cool of dawn. The fire behind her snapped, its warmth against her back, the only kindness she'd felt in days. Beyond the door, boots scuffed and voices muttered, the house stirring awake with no intention of gentleness. Gideon McKenna, her father, was a man built of old anger and whiskey. His frame filled the doorway when he entered, shoulders wide as the horizon. A black hat shadowed his face, but not the scowl etched there. Behind him, Prudence, his second wife, trailed like a bitter echo, her eyes quick and sharp, forever measuring what she might cut down to make herself taller. "You're slow," Gideon growled, his voice as cracked and dry as the land outside. "One hand, and you think you can still feed us?" Lark didn't answer. She'd learned long ago that words only fed the fire. She simply kept kneading, her bound hand hovering awkwardly at her side, her jaw set. Prudence's laugh came thin and cruel. "Look at her. Thinks she's some saint of the kitchen, more like a lame mule we keep out of pity." Lark swallowed the shame that rose hot and choking. Her broken hand throbbed with each heartbeat. It had happened 3 nights ago, her father's temper flaring when she refused to serve supper after he stumbled in drunk and snarling. He'd slammed her wrist against the edge of the table until bone gave way with a sick pop. She hadn't cried then, though tears had slid down her face like silent rain. The smell of baking biscuits filled the room now golden and rich, a fragrance that made the cruelty seem even sharper somehow. Cooking was the only place she felt whole, the only act that still belonged to her. The fire, the spices, the slow alchemy of turning flour and water into something that might comfort. These were the small mercies she carved out of an unkind life. Outside, a hawk cried, riding a ribbon of wind across the pale sky. Lark's gaze flicked briefly toward the window. Out there lay the open land, endless and wild, and sometimes she let herself dream that it might hold something better than this small, mean house. "Don't just stand there," Gideon barked, yanking her back to the present. "Finish up. We've got ranch hands coming through today, and they'll need feeding. Might even bring a buyer." The mention of outsiders made something tight coil in Lark's chest. She hated the way strangers looked at her. Pity, curiosity, sometimes open disdain. Still, she nodded once and reached for the skillet with her good hand, moving slow but sure. The hours passed in quiet labor. She tended bacon and eggs, stirred beans, lifted heavy pots despite the pain. Gideon and Prudence argued in the next room about debts and drought. Their voices a low rumble that occasionally spiked into shouting. Lark tuned it out, focusing instead on the small tasks that kept her mind from drifting too near despair. By mid-morning, the sun blazed high, turning the air thick and shimmering. Dust spiraled up from the distant road as riders approached. A handful of cowboys, and behind them a man who sat his horse with a quiet authority that seemed to part the heat itself. He was tall even from afar, broad-shouldered, his coat the color of storm clouds. His hat cast a shadow over his face, but the stillness of his presence carried farther than any shouted greeting. Gideon stepped out to meet them, his posture puffed with the false pride of a man deep in debt. Prudence followed, simpering, eager for notice. Lark stayed in the doorway, half hidden, the smell of cornbread clinging to her. She watched as the stranger dismounted with unhurried grace, boots sinking slightly into the dry earth. The man introduced himself, Jedediah Colt, owner of Colt River Ranch. His voice carried calm, low, and deliberate, like a creek that had seen many summers and never rushed. He shook Gideon's hand once, his expression unreadable, then let his gaze drift, slow assessing, until it found Lark in the shadows. Their eyes met, and the moment stretched thin and taut. Jed's stare wasn't pitying, nor was it cold. It was something else entirely, curiosity tempered by quiet respect. Lark felt her breath catch, surprised to be seen rather than judged. She looked away quickly, the heat rising to her cheeks. Prudence noticed, her smile sharpened. "That's just the girl," she said brightly. Too brightly, useless with that hand now, but still cooks. You'd think she was born for it, the way she clings to a stove. Lark's shame flared anew, but she kept her face still. Jed said nothing, though his gaze lingered a heartbeat longer before turning back to Gideon. A flicker of something, disapproval. Anger passed through his eyes, gone before it could be named. Lunch was served under the merciless sun. Lark carried platters to the long outdoor table, balancing them awkwardly with one hand, refusing help when a ranch hand reached toward her. Her pride was a fragile thing, but it was hers. The men ate heartily, their laughter coarse but harmless. Jed sat quiet among them, his attention wandering back to the kitchen door, where Lark moved like a wraith, present but untouchable. At one point he rose and stepped toward her, offering a small sack. "For the biscuits," he said simply. Inside were coffee beans, rare and fragrant. His voice held no pity, only acknowledgement. Lark froze, unsure what to say. "Thank you," she whispered at last, the words tasting strange and dangerous. Gideon's face darkened when he saw the exchange. Prudence's eyes gleamed with mean delight. Already spinning gossip from the briefest of gestures, the men rode off after the meal, dust swallowing them one by one until only Jed remained. He lingered a moment, his gaze sweeping the homestead, with something unreadable, perhaps calculation, perhaps quiet anger. Then he touched his hat to Lark in a gesture more respectful than anything she'd known in years, and rode away without another word. Inside, Gideon's silence was thunderous. He didn't speak, but the air turned heavy, dangerous. Prudence smirked, whispering poison into his ear. Lark kept her eyes down, heart pounding. She knew that look, the one her father wore when his pride had been wounded, and he sought someone to bleed for it. By nightfall, the house was dark except for the dying fire in the hearth. Lark sat alone at the table, cradling her bandaged hand, the scent of coffee beans lingering like a promise she dared not trust. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint echo of hoof-beat. As fading into night, she didn't know why the stranger's eyes haunted her, or why her father's silence felt more dangerous than his rage. But as the embers pulsed and shadows stretched long across the room, she sensed that something had shifted in the dry, unyielding air of Rattlesnake Hollow, something that might one day change everything. The next morning dawned pale and brittle, the sky a thin wash of silver before the sun burned at it gold. Lark woke early despite the ache in her splined hand, drawn from uneasy sleep by the sound of her father moving about. Gideon's boots thudded heavy across the porch as he checked tack and muttered to himself about money owed and cattle to sell. Prudence clattered in the other room, humming sharp and false as she polished the few silver spoons they owned. Perhaps imagining herself mistress of some finer house. The air smelled of dust and frying fat. Lark stirred it with quiet movements, her shoulders tight from the memory of yesterday's silence. She tried not to think of the stranger who had lingered after the ranch hands rode off, yet his gaze had stayed with her all night, a gaze without mockery, steady as an untouched pond. It was unsettling. to be looked at and not diminished. She rolled dough with careful pressure, leaning her weight on her good arm, trying to silence the tremor of unexpected hope. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, the heat arrived like a living thing. It shimmered across the yard where the well-rop swung gently in a dry wind. Lark swept the kitchen stoop, listening to the lonely creak of windmill and the faint murmur of town, waking beyond the red meaze. She wondered just briefly if Jadodia Cult was already miles away. But late morning brought the sound of hoof-beat ats again. Slow, measured, no clatter of a posy, just one rider. The dog barked once and then fell silent, tail low, as if sensing something formidable. Lark's pulse stumbled. She turned to see Jed approach, his great sorrel horse stirring plumes of pale dust. The man sat straight and easy in the saddle, his coat a dark sweep against the merciless light. Gideon emerged from the barn, already scowling. "Didn't expect you back so soon," he said, voice edged with suspicion. Jed's eyes held steady. "Left something yesterday." Prudence appeared behind Gideon, smiling with that sharp curiosity she reserved for any hint of advantage. "Well, now," she drawled, "seems the mighty Mr. Colt's got errands at our doorstep." Jed dismounted without answering her. He removed his hat briefly, a small courtesy that felt larger for its quietness, then turned to Lark, who stood stiff and uncertain near the door. "Wanted to pay proper for the meal," he said, holding out a small leather pouch. "Your biscuit could make a man forget the desert." The compliment was simple, but it hit like sunlight in a cold room. Lark blinked, caught between gratitude and the fear of provoking Gideon's temper. "It was nothing," she murmured. Gideon stepped forward, snatching the pouch before she could move. He waited in his palm, lips curling. "She's fed plenty without pay," he said. "Don't need charity." Jed didn't flinch. "Not charity, fair trade." His voice was soft but unyielding, a tone that made Gideon's posturing seem suddenly small. Prudence tittered nervously. "Well, we're obliged, I suppose." The girl's got a knack, even one-handed. Lark felt heat crawl up her neck at the mention of her injury. She lowered her gaze to the dust, wishing to disappear. Jed studied her quietly, then inclined his head. "Keep the coffee, too," he said. "Figure it'll suit her more than me." With that, he turned as if to leave, but Gideon's pride bristled. "You keep stopping by like this," Gideon said. "Folks will think you're sweet on a broken cook." The words hung cry in the air. Lark stiffened, humiliation burning her chest. Jed paused mid-step but didn't look back. Instead, he said in that same calm tone, "Let folks think what they want. They usually do." Then he mounted and rode off without hurry, the horse's hooves drumming a steady rhythm that lingered long after he vanished beyond the sage. Prudence laughed once, brittle and triumphant. "Hear that, Gideon? You're raising gossip now. Maybe she'll snare herself a husband after all." Gideon's face went hard as stone. "She'll do no such thing," he muttered, gripping the pouch so tight it squeaked. His pride had taken a blow. Lark knew the signs. All afternoon, the house was steeped in uneasy quiet. Lark scrubbed pans and tended beans, keeping out of her father's way. But the air felt altered, charged with a new electricity. She caught herself replaying Jed's words, simple, unhurried, but strangely protective. They lit a faint, rebellious spark somewhere deep. Though she fought to smother it, dreams were dangerous here. By evening, the sun bled orange over the mesas, throwing long shadows across the yard. The family sat down to supper in brittle silence. Gideon ate with a scowl. Prudence prattled about the price of sugar and the foolishness of ranchers, and Lark kept her head down, praying for the meal to end quietly. But just as the plates emptied, hoof beat, at sounded again, distant this time, moving fast, along the main road toward town. Gideon's head lifted like a hound catching scent. He rose, muttering about needing a drink and news from the saloon, and stalked out into the fading light. Prudence followed soon after, eager for gossip. Left alone, Lark lingered at the table, The silence felt different now, less suffocating, more like possibility. She turned over the small coffee beans Jed had given, inhaling their deep, bitter fragrance. No one had ever given her anything that wasn't meant to buy her silence or labor. This was different. Night settled, stars spilling across the velvet sky. Lark stepped outside for a breath of cool air, the world suddenly immense around her. Somewhere far off, coyotes yipped and fell silent. She imagined Jed riding back to his vast ranch, a man who could have ignored her pain but hadn't, not really, not with those quiet gestures that asked for nothing in return. The following days brought a slow shift. Jed began stopping by the homestead now, and then, always with a practical excuse, delivering flour, trading eggs for preserves, asking after the state of the well. He never lingered long, never crossed the invisible lines of propriety. Yet each visit felt like a stone placed gently on some unseen foundation. The town noticed, of course, whispers threaded through the mercantile, the church porch, the saloon. Colt's got eyes for that McKenna girl. Some voices sneered, others softened with sympathy. Gideon bristled at every rumor, drinking harder, his temper simmering just below the surface. Prudence wore a sly smile that promised trouble. Lark tried to keep her head down, but each time Jed appeared, quiet, courteous, unbothered by talk, something inside her straightened a little. She began to meet his eyes when they spoke, if only for a heartbeat. She found herself humming softly while cooking, a sound she hadn't made in years. One afternoon, he arrived with a sack of early apples from his orchard. Figured you might make pie, he said simply. His gaze flicked to her wrapped hand, then back to her face. Need help peeling. She hesitated, torn between pride and gratitude. I can manage, she said softly. He nodded once, accepting her answer without offense, and left the apples on the stoop. That simple respect felt more healing than any bandage. Yet peace never lasted long under Gideon's roof. That night, he came home drunk, anger sharpened by gossip. His words were slurred but vicious, accusing her of flaunting herself to trap a rich man. When she tried to retreat, he slammed his fist on the table, making dishes jump. Prudence's laughter rang thin and poisonous in the corner. Lark said nothing, though her heart beat so hard it hurt. She gripped the table edge with her good hand, steadying herself. For the first time, she did not feel small. She felt tired of shrinking. When Gideon finally stumbled to bed, cursing, she stayed awake by the dying fire. The apples sat in their sack nearby, glowing softly in the ember's light. She reached out, touched the smooth skin of one fruit, and felt a strange resolve stir, a whisper of life beyond fear. Outside, in the moonlit dust, hoof beats echoed faintly, heading toward the hollow once more. The heat came earlier than usual that week, a heavy, unmoving weight that pressed air flat against the ground. The sky was the color of brass, and the sun seemed intent on burning the world clean. Lark felt it most in the kitchen, where the stove turned the small space into an oven. Sweat dampened the bandage around her still tender hand as she chopped onions one-handed, the knife rocking awkwardly, but steady enough to keep her rhythm. She told herself rhythm meant control, and control kept despair at bay. Gideon had been drinking since dawn. The low growl of his voice drifted in from the yard where he argued with Prudence about the latest drought-struck cattle sale. The rancher's visits, Jed's visits, had become fuel for Gideon's anger. Each quiet kindness Jed offered, every sack of flour or bag of apples had stoked the man's pride into something ugly and watchful. Rumors in town had only worsened it. Lark felt the tension in the house like a taut rope ready to snap. That afternoon, while she prepared supper, Prudence drifted in her silk shawl, imported from some mail-order catalog, fluttering around thin shoulders. "You think you're clever," she said lightly, but her eyes were sharp as needles. "You think a man like Jedediah Colt looks twice at a broken cook." Lark didn't answer. She had learned silence, but it was a silence that trembled, now no longer meek, but full of swallowed words. Prudence smiled with a sweetness that cut. Men like that come to taste a meal, maybe a little flattery. They don't marry ruined girls from hard dirt farms. She leaned closer, whispering, "Best remember where you belong." Lark kept chopping. Each slice of the knife steadied her shaking heart. But when Prudence left, the kitchen felt colder despite the stifling heat. Near sunset, Jed arrived unexpectedly. His horse clattered softly in the yard, hoof stirring lazy dust devils. Lark, startled, wiped flour from her skirt and stepped outside. Jed stood there tall and quiet, hat in hand. "Brought you something," he said. He held out a small tin box. Inside lay a set of delicate measuring spoons, polished to a dull shine. Tools for a baker. Precision figured cooking's easier with the right tools. For a heartbeat, Lark could not speak. Her throat felt full of unshed tears, not of sadness, but of the rare ache of being considered. "Thank you," she managed, soft as a prayer. Jed's gaze lingered on her injured hand, but he didn't comment. Instead, his eyes lifted to hers, steady, calm. "You holding up?" Something in the question threatened to break her, but she swallowed hard and nodded. "I am." Gideon appeared in the doorway, then his face stormed dark. "You got business here, Colt." Jed didn't flinch. "Just a visit. You visited enough." Gideon's words were low, but they vibrated with a dangerous edge. "Don't fill my girl's head with notions. She's got work to do." Jed studied him for a long, cool moment before answering. "Maybe let her decide what notions she's due." His tone stayed even, but the air thickened with quiet challenge. Gideon's jaw worked like he might strike then and there. Prudence's shadow shifted behind him, eager for drama. But after a talk beat, Gideon spat into the dirt and turned away, muttering curses. Jed tipped his hat toward Lark and mounted without further word, his departure a measured, deliberate calm that seemed to infuriate Gideon more than shouting ever could. The silence he left behind was jagged. Prudence hissed something in Gideon's ear. Lark couldn't hear the words, but she saw the way his shoulders stiffened and knew trouble was coming. That night, the storm finally broke. Not with rain, the clouds still refused mercy, but with fury. Gideon returned from the saloon, drunk and raging, the smell of cheap whiskey rolling before him. He slammed the door so hard the wall shook. Prudence lingered behind, smirking with the cruel delight of someone safe behind another's temper. "You think you're clever?" Gideon slurred, echoing Prudence's earlier taunt. "Think you can catch yourself a rich man, cook your way into comfort?" Lark stayed by the hearth, poker in hand, though only to steady herself. "I don't," she began, but his roar cut her off. "Don't lie to me." He swept an arm across the shelf, sending jars crashing, flour and sugar exploding into white ghosts across the floor. "You shamed this house with your quiet looks and your petty tricks." She flinched but did not retreat. Some buried thing in her, the part that had survived the breaking of her hand, would not let her cower. "I shame no one," she said, voice trembling but audible. His eyes went cold and wild. He grabbed the old, worn book from the counter, her mother's recipe book, the one treasure she'd saved through years of silence. With a vicious motion, he flung it into the hearth. Flames caught the brittle pages instantly, curling them into black ash. "No." The cry tore from her before she could stop it. She lunged forward, trying to snatch the book back with her good hand, but the fire was faster. Heat seared her fingers. She stumbled back, tears blinding her. Gideon stood over her, chest heaving, a king over ruin. "That's what dreams get you." He spat. Then he turned and staggered toward his room, leaving the scent of smoke and whiskey behind. Prudence's laughter trailed after him like a snake. For a long time, Lark stayed crouched on the floor, watching the last embers of the book die. She felt hollow, scoured clean. The kitchen, the one place she'd ever felt whole, had been violated beyond repair. When she finally rose, the room looked different, sharp, foreign, no longer a safe refuge. She moved with slow care, sweeping up shards of glass, wiping flour from the counters. Her hand throbbed fiercely, but she ignored it. Something had shifted inside her, a new hardness settling where old obedience had lived. Outside, thunder rolled without rain. The windows rattled in their frames. She imagined the land itself aching for release. The next morning, her eyes were swollen but dry. She dressed in silence, braided her hair tight, and prepared breakfast as if nothing had happened. But every movement was deliberate, measured. Grief had sharpened into something steel, like Jed arrived again just after sunrise, a sack of feet slung across his saddle. He didn't knock this time, just stepped into the yard and paused, reading the ruin of broken jars still scattered near the porch. His gaze flicked to her face. Catching the faint red around her eyes, "You all right?" he asked quietly. She almost lied. Almost, but then she said, "He burned my mother's book." Her voice cracked once, then steadied, said, "Dreams are worthless." Jed's expression didn't change much, but a muscle ticked in his jaw. Slowly, he removed his hat and stood there silent. The morning wind tugging at his coat. "I see," he said at last, the words simple but heavy with restrained fury. He didn't press her, didn't step closer, just lingered long enough that she felt his anger like a shield she hadn't asked for. Then he nodded once and turned back to his horse, his departure quieter than any vow could be. Lark watched him go, heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and hope. Something in Jed had shifted, too. She could feel it in the deliberate set of his shoulders, the way he rode out with a purpose he hadn't carried before. For the first time, she wondered if her father's reign of quiet terror might not be unshakable after all. And as the horizon swallowed Jed's figure, a thought flickered through her grief like a candle. Maybe the world was larger than this house, and maybe she was not as alone as she'd believed. The days after the fire in the hearth passed with an uncanny stillness, the kind that often comes before something breaks. Lark moved through them like a ghost, cooking out of habit rather than heart. The scent of biscuits no longer comforted. It only reminded her of what had been lost. She felt stripped raw. Yet inside that emptiness, a strange resolve had begun to smolder. She did not speak of it. She did not need to. Jedodia Colt came twice in those days. Each time he arrived with no fanfare, offering something practical, a sack of flour, a coil of rope. But his eyes held questions he never forced into words. He watched the bruised quiet around her as if memorizing it. On the second visit, he asked, "Your father owes." The question was low, careful. Lark hesitated, then nodded once to half the town, I reckon. Cards, whiskey, cattle he never paid for. Her voice was soft but flat, like a ledger recited. Jed studied her a long moment, and the deed to this place locked in his desk. Mama's land, but he signed his name on it after she passed, been selling pieces to keep his bottle full. Something in Jed's gaze darkened, though his face stayed calm. He nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and left without another word. That evening, Lark stood on the porch as the sky bled copper and violet. Somewhere in the distance, she saw dust rise from the trail leading toward town, then fade again. She did not know what Jed was planning, but she felt the shape of it in the air, like the shift of wind before a storm. 2 days later, word began to ripple through Rattlesnake Hollow. Gideon McKenna's debts, long whispered about in saloons and backrooms, had been called in at once. The banker refused more credit. The feed store wanted payment, and the cattle buyers had turned their backs. Men spoke in low tones about how Jed Colt had quietly visited each note holder with cash and calm authority. He hadn't threatened or pleaded. He'd simply bought Gideon's shame out from under him. By law and signature, the homestead now belonged to Jedodia Colt. Gideon came roaring home that night, drunker than Lark had ever seen him. The door slammed open, dust gusting in with him. "You," he bellowed, pointing a shaking finger at her as if she'd betrayed him. "You think this is clever. Think you've got that rancher doing your bidding." His face was blotched red with fury and liquor. Lark stood by the stove, her heart hammering, but her back straight. "I didn't ask him. Liar." Gideon lunged forward, but this time she didn't flinch. Something in her stillness must have startled him because he stopped short, swaying, cursing under his breath. Prudence watched from the corner, silent and weary now that the walls were shifting. Her sly smile was gone. Even she seemed to sense power tilting in some new direction. When Gideon stormed out again, slamming the door so hard the hinges groaned. The house seemed to exhale. Lark sank into a chair, trembling from the held line she hadn't crossed, but hadn't surrendered either. She didn't know if Jed meant to help her or simply settle a score. But for the first time, her father's rage hadn't broken her. The next morning, the truth arrived in papers. Jed himself rode up, calm and dust-covered, dismounted, and handed Gideon a folded document. Gideon tore it open and read silently, face-draining pale. "You sold your land the day you signed those loans." Jed said quietly, "I just paid the price you wouldn't." Gideon's head jerked up wild. "You think you can take my house, my kitchen?" Jed's gaze was level and unflinching. "I've taken nothing that wasn't already lost. You gambled it away, but the deed's clean now. Lark's safe here if she wants to stay." A silence thick as storm clouds stretched between them. Prudence slipped further back into the house, unwilling to be caught in the middle. Gideon sputtered threats, but there was no weight left behind them. The law was not on his side. Lark stood frozen, the paper fluttering slightly in Gideon's trembling hands. The word struck her like a bell ringing deep where no hope had dared to live. She had not been saved by force. Jed had not stormed in with fists or guns. He had dismantled her father's power quietly, piece by piece, until it collapsed under its own greed. Gideon spat at the dirt, rage, and humiliation twisting his features. He stalked to the barn, mounted his horse, and rode hard toward town, leaving a cloud of dust and silence in his wake. Jed turned to Lark then, his expression softened but grave. "I don't aim to own you," he said, voice low and steady. "This place can be yours if you want it. I just made sure it wasn't his to hurt you with anymore." She swallowed hard, fighting the sudden rush of tears. "Why?" Jed looked away toward the horizon where light shimmered over the red mesas. "Because nobody should have to keep standing up alone forever." The word struck something deep. She wanted to say thank you, but gratitude felt too small. She wanted to say she didn't know if she could build a life from ashes, but fear felt smaller than the strange swell of freedom rising in her chest. So she only nodded once, unable to speak past the knot in her throat. For the next few days, the town buzzed with the news. Some called Jed a fool for paying a drunkard's debts. Others whispered admiration. Women came by with cautious smiles, offering Lark small tokens, yeast, butter, a bolt of cloth, as if acknowledging her new place in the world. She moved through it quietly, not triumphant, but slowly straightening like a plant turning toward long-denied light. Jed didn't crowd her. He visited once, bringing fence wire and asking if she wanted help mending the north pasture. They worked side by side in easy silence. He let her set the pace, never speaking of the deed or the rumors swirling like dust around them. But that evening, alone in the kitchen, Lark found herself staring at the empty shelf where her mother's cookbook had once lived. She thought of the fire, of all that had been taken, and felt a sudden fierce desire, not just to survive, but to create again. She gathered scraps of paper and began to write down the recipes she remembered, hand trembling but determined. Outside, night deepened. Somewhere far across the darkened fields, a single lantern bobbed slowly closer, its glow warm and steady against the vast dark. She knew who it belonged to before she even rose to look. For the first time in years, the sound of approaching hoofbeats did not fill her with dread. It sounded like a door opening. It sounded like possibility. Autumn came slow to Rattlesnake Hollow, as if even the seasons hesitated to cross its hard soil. The air cooled by degrees, losing summer's harsh bite. Cottonwoods turned gold along the dry creek bed, their leaves trembling like coins in a gambler's hand. In the small homestead kitchen, Lark worked with quiet purpose, her mend hands stiff but capable. She kneaded bread with deliberate strength, the dough warm and pliant under her fingers. Smoke curled from the chimney, carrying the scent of roasting meat across the yard. Life had begun to tilt in unfamiliar ways. Neighbors came now not to mock or pry, but to trade eggs, share news, and more than once to thank Lark for feeding them in hard times. She found herself laughing, sometimes softly, surprised at the sound. The house, once filled with Gideon's rage, had grown still enough for her to hear her own thoughts, yet peace carried its own weight. Freedom was new, untested, and terrifying. Jed Colt visited when he had reason, never lingering without one. Sometimes it was fence wire, sometimes coffee beans or fresh apples. He worked alongside her on repairs, always respectful, never presuming. Their silence together had changed, once careful and tense, now companionable with small sparks of shared humor. He'd nod toward her bread and say, "Best thing in 5 counties," and she'd roll her eyes, but hide a smile. Still, there was a distance he kept, a patience that felt like waiting at a closed door. One evening, after the first real chill of autumn, Jed arrived later than usual. The sky was bruised purple, stars just breaking through. He brought no supplies this time, only himself. He paused at the threshold, hat in hand, his face half shadowed by lantern light. "Evening," he said softly. Lark felt a nervous flutter, rare and unsettling. "Evening." He lingered, gaze sweeping the kitchen, the bread cooling on the counter, the neat jars of preserve she'd built from a summer of quiet work. "Place looks alive," he said, "feels different." "It's mine now," she answered before she could stop herself, then softer, "Thanks to you." Jed stepped closer, slow enough not to startle. "Not thanks to me. You've held this place together with one hand and sheer grit. I just cleared the wolves off the porch." She met his eyes then, something fragile and fierce rising in her. "It doesn't feel like enough. Starting over with nothing but flour and scraps of paper." His expression gentled. "It's more than most folks ever have." After a pause, he added, "You're more than you know, Lark." The words were simple, but they sank deep, touching wounds she hadn't realized still bled. For a moment, neither spoke. The fire popped in the hearth, shadows swaying across the walls. Then the sound of hooves shattered the quiet, heavy, urgent, and too familiar. Lark stiffened, the years of fear still quick to answer. Jed's head turned toward the door even before it swung wide. Gideon staggered in, eyes bloodshot, face wild with drink and humiliation. He smelled of whiskey and failure, of a man who'd lost everything but his rage. "You think you've beaten me," he snarled, voice ragged. "You think this house is yours now." His gaze flicked to Jed with venom. "And you, buying up what's mine, thinking you can take my daughter and my land in one blow." Lark's heart slammed against her ribs, but she did not retreat. She stood beside the table, fingers tightening on the chair's back. "It was never yours to break," she said quietly, but the quiet had iron in it. Gideon's face twisted. Ungrateful wretch. He took a step forward, fist lifting. Jed moved then, not with violence, but with a steadiness that stopped Gideon mid-step. He positioned himself between father and daughter, voice calm, but cold. "You've lost your claim here, McKenna. Best leave before you lose more." Gideon spat, but the room had shifted. The man who'd once ruled through fear now looked small before their combined stillness, and outside, a rustle stirred, neighbors drawn by the commotion, lanterns glowing in the dark. Word of Gideon's deaths and Jed's quiet out had traveled. The town stood ready. Faces appeared in the doorway. Mr. Tully from the feed store, Mrs. Harper with her shawl wrapped tight, 2 ranch hands leaning silent but firm. Gideon faltered, seeing no allies. The weight of the room pressed back at him. For the first time, Lark felt fear drain away, replaced by something like power, not borrowed from Jed, but born from her own endurance witnessed at last. Her voice, when it came, was steady. "Leave." Gideon stared at her, shock flickering behind fury. Then, with a choked curse, he turned and shoved past the watching faces into the night. His horse clattered off into darkness, swallowed by the hollow. That had once been his kingdom. The silence left behind was vast and trembling. Lark's hands shook, but not from fear. Jed stayed close, but did not touch her, simply offering presence. The neighbors lingered a moment longer, exchanging nods with Lark, small, respectful, acknowledging her stand before drifting away, lantern light bobbing back into the night. When the door shut, only firelight remained warm and alive. Lark sank into the chair, breath shaking free of her chest. Jed crouched across from her, eyes steady. "You did that," he said quietly, "not me." "You," she swallowed, tears burning but unshed. "I'm free," she whispered as if testing the shape of it. He nodded. "You are." For a long time they sat without words, letting the truth settle. Then Jed reached out slow, giving her time to refuse. She didn't. His rough hand closed gently over hers, scarred fingers against her healing ones. "I don't want to own you, Lark," he said, voice hushed but sure. "But I'd stand beside you if you'll let me." Her throat closed around all the answers she could have given. Instead, she turned her hand and laced her fingers with his. The gesture was small, almost shy, but it carried the weight of every silent meal, every wound endured, every dream reborn. Outside, wind stirred the golden cottonwood leaves, scattering them across the yard like blessings. Inside, the fire light wrapped them in a quiet that felt nothing like fear. It felt like a beginning.